Welcome to Forthright. I'm Sulani Madsen, podcasting today on a subject that has made me grit my teeth at the public virtue signaling for several years now. And I also will be sharing reader feedback, which is why I waited a week to record. I was hoping to have one of my critics join me, but alas, no luck yet in connecting. The headline chosen by the editor, as published April 20, 2023 in the Spokesman Review, Migration, Displacement are constants in our history. Land acknowledgments recited at public meetings are reminiscent of a perfunctory mea culpa at the start of a Catholic Mass. Unless you're planning to give it back, it would be better to just keep the apology for stolen land to yourself. Displacement has been a constant across all continents since time immemorial. We're not any different. Whether you count your point of origin as a fossilized 3 or 4 million year old skeleton in Ethiopia, or start from the oral tradition of Adam and Eve's eviction from the Garden of Eden, people have dispersed, displacing others who either assimilated or moved on. The Americas were the last frontier. When their ancient ancestors left the settled Old World behind to cross the land bridge from Asia, those we now call Native Americans became the pioneers of human sprawl into virgin landscapes. They displaced 78 species of megafauna in North America by driving them to extinction, according to the Wildlife Society. Maybe that requires a mea culpa too. Land acknowledgments aren't going to catch on in the Old World, no matter how progressive European culture becomes. Tribe on tribe land displacement is the root of centuries of war on the continent. On a recent European vacation on the Danube River, I imagined writing a land acknowledgment for Budapest, Hungary. This land was the traditional homeland of Germanic tribes and possibly also the Celts until the Magyars from the Ural Mountains moved into the Carpathian Plains, overwhelming and absorbing the indigenous peoples. They were in turn ruled by the Romans but regained their sovereignty, building the culture now known as Hungarian. Having faced absorption, displacement, and attempted erasure at various times by Mongols, Turks, Austrians, Germans, and Russians, Hungary now seeks to nurture its relationships with its neighbors through the European Union and NATO. Despite its long history, Budapest doesn't have any old buildings by European standards because, as our city guide noted, the Hungarians have a 600-year history of losing wars and revolutions. They're still rebuilding parts of the city destroyed during the 50-day siege of Budapest in 1945. Hungary is proud of its 1956 uprising against Russian domination, even though it lost that revolution too, in a shorter siege of the city. It is now ranked as one of the unhappiest countries in Europe with one of the most beautiful capital cities. The people of Vienna would debate the beauty claim and proudly boast of their city's victory almost 5 centuries ago, turning back a Turkish invasion. Hungarians still remember their defeat by the Turks in 1541 and their absorption into the Ottoman Empire, a period that ended after another siege of the city. Ancient history from a U.S. perspective is still relevant in modern times. A Hungarian described one of the common bits of graffiti under the Soviet-Russian domination. The Turks ruled us for 150 years, but we didn't become Turkish. When the Austrians and Hungarians were battling on the frontiers of Europe, the New World was only beginning to be drawn into the global network of trade that had dominated the Old World for millennia. North Americans in general have a poor grasp of world history, like teenagers who think the world started the day they were born. There was a lot going on, whether you start the clock at 1776, 1619, 1565, or 1492. A building only has to make it to 50 years old in the U.S. to be eligible for our Register of Historic Places. It's a little different in Europe. As our vacationing group waited last week for the start of a city walking tour in Regensburg, Germany, one of the guests asked about a crenellated tower next to us. "Oh, that's not very old, only about 500 years. I will show you old buildings later," the guide said dismissively. Regensburg is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. We walked the path of the invaders who absorbed the land south of the Danube into the Roman Empire and built the earliest city walls, using the river as the border with barbaric tribes to the north. When the indigenous tribes replaced the retreating Romans around 500 AD, they turned to trading and either incorporated the old walls into new buildings or used them as a quarry. Regensburg's golden age lasted for centuries. The only stone bridge across the Danube for many miles was built in the 12th century, the town hall in the 13th century. Tolls on the bridge and its key location on the trading routes to Asia made Regensburg into a cosmopolitan city-state for 1,000 years, until new empires arose in the east and trade routes shifted. Even after its economic importance faded, it remained the seat of the deliberative council of the Holy Roman Empire until 1806. Meanwhile, back in the Americas, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark had just made it back to St. Louis to report on the indigenous peoples they'd bumped into while exploring the continent. No apology necessary. Now to the emails. From Jim, whom I know in real life, a short comment. Oh dear, so many apple carts overturned and so many hurt feelings. Clearly fake news. Well done, Sue. Yeah, thank you, Jim. And from Mr. Bailey, last week would have been a perfect time to print it. Pointing out that someone is being childish is best done at the time. Now it will lack the proper sting. Great job. Mr. Bailey said that because he knew this column was pulled at the last hour because the opinion page editor realized the front page story on the day it was originally supposed to run, the week after we just got back from vacation, was about a dispute between two tribes over the naming of the downtown stadiums in Spokane and whose land was it anyway. It's disputes like that are what kept the European continent embroiled in war for centuries, for millennia, and the North American tribes seeking alliances and fielding war parties. There is nothing new under the sun in human beings pushing each other around. From Bill, there was this email. Shields up. I hope after your courageous essay this past week. I have work in progress attached on a similar theme, but a few ideas on which I'd value your assessment. Key points. America is the first gathering of all human tribes, gathered voluntarily except those stolen from Africa. The African tribes helped transform us with the civil rights movement centered on Christianity, and we are history's first experiment in multi-tribal governance on something other than the divine right of kings or dictators. Many blessings as you await the arrival of spring. Really good points. Actually, this is the first multi-tribal country that has tried to stay together. Yugoslavia tried that for a while and broke apart. Let's hope that we don't go that direction. And Bill, if you're listening to this, I haven't forgotten that you sent a file with your thoughts. I look forward to reading it. I do think spring is finally here. We have over 100 baby goats in the barnyard, and we're not done with the kidding season just yet. I will get to some more reading after things slow down. Eleanor had a thoughtful response, delivered in the compliment sandwich style. She writes, I happen to agree with you that the migration and displacement seem to be natural occurrences throughout world history, and that Europeans have a broader view because their history goes back so much farther. It helps to look at U.S. history from a world perspective. I was kind of disappointed, but not surprised that you left out another current related issue. Sure, apologizing in public meetings now for taking land from the people who are already here is somewhat disingenuous. We seem to be living in an era of extreme sensitivity, what the right calls wokeness, especially by the left. But aren't our current issues with migration from the South a part of that natural order of migration and displacement? Popular commentators in the conservative media have been wringing their hands over this migration from the South, saying Democrats want these migrants to displace Americans of European descent, as if this migration is a big Democratic plot. Yes, people who enter our country without permission are breaking the law, but those kinds of laws have been broken throughout history by people who are driven to migrate. You might have addressed this in your article, as it is part of the same issue. At least it appears so to me. I do realize you have limited space. Thanks for listening. I enjoy your opinion pieces. As you can see, they usually make me think. That does my heart good. Thank you for taking the time to provide thoughtful feedback, Ellie. Making people think is what I really hope to do. But you are right about the patterns of migration from the South, and also about the space limitations of the op-ed format. I run into that every week. Comparing the migration pressure on the U.S. southern border to similarly pressured border on any other continent would tend to support the close the border argument. Because I can't off the top of my head think of a single instance in the recorded history of civilizations where migrants coming in were welcomed uncritically, if not with outright hostility by the receiving country. Egypt and Sudan, for example, have disputed their border and border crossers for thousands of years. The Roman fortress of Regensburg was founded precisely to close the border of the empire at the Danube. Now, even Ellis Island was designed to turn back undesirables who didn't pass the screening criteria. And some, but not all, indigenous tribes in the Americas resisted the border crossers from Europe and the resistors were conquered by war, no differently than the Magyars defeating the indigenous Huns and establishing a new blended civilization. It was a fascinating rabbit trail to consider on this morning's email roundup. Thanks again for writing and for being a reader. That was a response that I sent to Eleanor. I really did appreciate that thoughtful response from her. One more email and we'll get to the guest editorial rebuttal. From Wayne, your recent column regarding migration and displacement is spot on. These days it is ever so popular to be a victim, and therefore it is often advantageous to blame someone else for nearly everything. As you say, migration usually causes problems, but people have been displacing people ever since there have been people. Many of the displacements resulted in total extermination of the displaced. It's not nice, but it is a fact. Thank you for your column on the topic. And Wayne, you are quite right about genocide, often being the result of clashes by migrating populations with their predecessors. We certainly have that in North America, and it's an ugly part of history, as anyone who knows why Hangman Creek got its name understands. It's a reminder of a past we don't want to repeat. So I'm going to include in the Substack post a link to a thoughtful response from Michael Trelevin, who identifies himself as a retired professor of political science at Gonzaga University. It was published several days after my column, and I think we'd find a few points of agreement if we had a conversation. I've emailed him, but we haven't connected yet, and if we do, I'll invite him to a forthright conversation. And again, that's why I waited to record this column and commentary. I appreciate Professor Trelevin's phrasing, noting that he was making assumptions or interpretations of my words. He said, I think, so he was expressing his thoughts, but he didn't turn his op-ed with a different point of view on land acknowledgments into a personal conflict. His response was very much in the braver angel spirit of civil debate, and that's what I appreciated about it. But I'd like to read the opening paragraphs, which summarize his rebuttal, and then I'll respond. From Professor Trelevin. Madsen explains the spirit of her objection in her first sentence, in which she characterizes as perfunctory the confession of sin which occurs at the start of every Roman Catholic Mass. Just how she is certain of this, I cannot tell. Surely it is valuable for Christians to consider and acknowledge our sins with whatever attention we individually give. Madsen is also mistaken, I think, to conclude that no apology is necessary. This view does not hold up if we consider the historical record. So, to Professor Trelevin, the mea culpa analogy was inspired by a friend raised Catholic. As a Protestant, it's not part of my tradition, although we do have a confession of sins in the Protestant liturgy. And I'm sure it can be meaningful, just as I may experience a profound connection with God while singing the doxology after the offering time, or I may feel a deep sense of patriotism while reciting the Pledge of Allegiance or singing the Star-Spangled Banner. But I am equally sure that any of these rituals, which can be good reminders, can also be rendered perfunctory by the repetition, just by the distractions of the day. And I have yet to hear a really heartfelt recitation of a land acknowledgement. At best, I've heard them recited with self-conscious righteousness and obligation. Now, that may be my own eye-rolling, interfering with my perception, but that is my perception, and I'm not alone in that. As for apologizing for the past, I'll close with this passage from the Rubaiyat, attributed to Omar Khayyam, who lived 1048 to 1131, a Persian poet, mathematician, and astronomer. The moving finger writes, and having writ, moves on, nor all thy piety nor wit shall lure it back to cancel half a line, nor all thy tears wash out a word of it. In other words, sometimes that apology just isn't going to change a thing. Thanks for joining me on this edition of Forthright, and please subscribe on Substack with or without making a pledge if you'd like emails notifying you of new material.